Every murder is a heinous act that will cause a ripple effect in whichever pond it occurs. That is not up for debate. Whenever a human life is lost by someone else, it is sure to leave behind some unseen scars. However, it is something entirely different when such acts occur around or because of a celebrity. While normally an average person would not have a personal relation with any of these celebrities, one thing is for sure that celebrities play a big part in our life. Thus, when crimes occur to or by these celebrities who seem so untouched by natural circumstances that would affect either of us, it surely reminds us that at the end of the day, everyone is human, regardless of their social status or money. One crime that will forever shock those interested in professional sports is the double homicide of Nancy Benoit and Daniel Benoit, followed by the suicide of professional wrestler Chris Benoit.
Nobody expects their friend to kill their family. Like, what?
I can't point my finger at one thing and say, this is what caused my brother-in-law to snap.
People need to understand that that was not him. He was my hero.
I need to talk about this. If you're going to say I'm glorifying a murder, stop listening now.
Now we all know Chris Benoit, or the Crippler, as the fierce, dedicated athlete who wowed us with his skills in the ring. But behind the championships and the thrilling matches, there's a whole other side to this story that we need to explore. Come along as I take you on a roller coaster of emotions, delving into the life of Chris Benoit, the man, the legend, and the struggles he faced. While I won't condone the events that unfolded, this video will be all about understanding, compassion, and the importance of mental health. So grab some snacks, sit back, and get ready for a journey that will challenge your perceptions and leave you reflecting on the impact of fame on the human spirit. Who was Chris Benoit? Now, this man needs no introduction to wrestling fans, but for the rest of you, don't worry, I got it covered. Born to Michael and Mary Benoit on the 21st of May, 1967 in Alberta, Canada. He was fond of wrestling from a young age, idolizing wrestlers such as Bret Hart and Dynamite Kid. His passion for wrestling was intensified after attending a wrestling show during his pre-teens. Now you see, Chris was hell-bent on achieving his dream, and so he started his training at the Hart Dungeon, which was a dream come true for him considering he was under Stu Hart, who was the son of his idol Bret Hart. He later began his professional wrestling career in 1985 in Canada, and then moving on to America and Japan as well, amassing a popular fan following for himself. He found his place in the World Championship Wrestling in the mid-1990s after a decade of professional wrestling. Now Chris was a force to be reckoned with, in the ring. He quickly became noticed by the executives and was moved to more prominent projects. Now here's where things get a bit weird. While he was working for the WCW, he was written to have a staged affair with Nancy Sullivan, the wife of another wrestling talent, Kevin Sullivan. Yeah, it kinda is gross. But what's even weirder is that Kevin himself would write the headlines for the supposed affair. But that's not all. Since there was a staged affair, Chris and Nancy were forced to spend a lot of time together, and that resulted in the both of them becoming very well acquainted with each other. Now get this. Nancy leaves her husband, Kevin Sullivan, and files for divorce because she actually decides to pursue Chris Benoit instead. Now, if this sounds like a bunch of high school drama to you, you won't be incorrect. But this wasn't new to Nancy, who was a professional model but always had a knack for wrestling. She had actually divorced her previous husband to get married to Kevin, and now the whole thing just repeated itself. But we could say that Kevin brought this upon himself. My guy literally sabotaged his marriage over some publicity. The affair was staged in 1996, and Nancy filed for a divorce in 1997. Nancy would later get engaged to Chris, and they got married in early 2000s. Before marriage, though, Nancy would give birth to her first and only child, Daniel, fathered by Chris Benoit. Now, even though Daniel was Nancy's only child, Chris already had 2 more kids from previous relations. It would be less than 3 years into their marriage when Nancy again files for divorce, saying their marriage is beyond repair, and gets a restraining order against Chris. Their divorce actually never went through, and the restraining order was dropped too. Chris Benoit left WCW for WWE in the late 90s, seeking more opportunities. After the no-compete clause expired, he made his triumphant debut in WWE as part of The Radicals, alongside other talented wrestlers. He went on to have an unforgettable career in WWE, leaving a lasting legacy in the wrestling world. The incident. It was a weekend in June of 2007 when the tragic events occurred. Chris had missed a WE event, which was unusual for him, but at that time, no one would have thought it would become one of the darkest days in wrestling history. While we don't really know much about what went inside the house at that time, many wrestlers have come forward talking about how they received phone calls or messages from Chris the entire weekend.
I had to leave my kids with somebody for the weekend on an emergency. I would have no problems leaving them with Chris. So to this day, we still don't know why, and you'll never know why. And
we now know from the autopsy reports that Nancy was the first of the Benoits to meet her fate. Nancy's limbs were bound, and her injuries show that Benoit had pressed his knee into her back while pulling a cord around her neck, strangling her to death. The cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation. The next morning, Chris drugged his 7-year-old son with Xanax and then brutally suffocated him using one of his famous moves, the crossface. Benoit also left a copy of the Bible next to both bodies, which was unusual since he really wasn't that religious, perhaps as a way of asking for forgiveness. Later that day, he contacted Chavo Guerrero, the nephew of Eddie Guerrero, one of Chris's closest friends, and told him that Nancy and Daniel had food poisoning. Both of them were dead at the time he made this call. He also sent him a text saying, "The dogs are enclosed in the pool area and the back door is open." Chavo also recalls that something sounded off with Chris during that call, saying he told him, "Chavo, I love you," before hanging up. The next day on June 24, 2007, Chris Benoit died by suicide, creating a noose from the end of a weight machine cord to hang himself. Benoit was found by the police hanging from the pulley cable. Chris Benoit's sister, Sandra Toffaloni, later revealed some further details about what Chris was really doing during that horrible weekend, saying that Chris's search history showed that he had researched about the quickest and easiest ways to break a neck. Furthermore, Chris had also looked up the story of Prophet Elijah and, even more disturbingly, the resurrection of a dead boy, which we suppose was about his son. After Chris had missed the event, Chavo got worried for his well-being and showed his texts to the head of relations, John Laurinaitis, which prompted them to send police over to Chris's location. The police would later find the 3 dead bodies in the house.
And she said, "It's been 3 or 4 days since I've seen anybody over there." There was 2 large canines in the yard. If I remember correctly, they were German Shepherds. We asked her if there was any place she could put the dogs at so we could go up there and do the welfare check. And she said, "Oh yeah, me and the dogs get along great. I feed them whenever they're out of town."
Possible reasons. If we think about the unfortunate event that took place, none of us can say for sure why it happened. Surely no one in their right mind would commit to doing such an act. But here are some of the reasons that are hypothesized as to what provoked Chris Benoit to murder his family and then commit suicide. Alcohol abuse. According to Hardcore Holly's speculation in his autobiography, alcohol might have played a bigger role than many believe. Being someone who traveled a lot with the wrestler, Holly claimed that Benoit tended to consume more alcohol during periods of domestic issues with his wife. Even at the scene of the crime, police investigators discovered several wine bottles, half drunk or more. These findings do raise some questions on the link between Chris's alcohol consumption and struggles, shedding some light on the heartbreaking events that unfolded. Holly has since said in interviews Benoit was one of the kindest human beings you would ever find. She went on to say, "I don't know what happened. I just honestly couldn't tell you what happened. Chris was one of the kindest, politest people. I never saw the guy get mad, not one single time. He didn't get upset about anything." Steroid abuse. You know, this theory about steroids and roid rage has been floating around for a while. Although it is hard to believe that someone might have a roid rage over a course of 3 days, it's no secret that Chris Benoit had been using steroids over the course of his entire career. It is only after the death of Eddie Guerrero that WWE started a crackdown over the usage of steroids in 2005. And here's the thing, police actually found texts between Benoit and his wife where she complained about having to deal with the wrestler's roid rage. Now, it is possible that Chris Benoit might have stopped taking steroids by then because of the rigorous drug testing conducted by the WWE. Like, you couldn't even take a high-powered aspirin without a prescription. But you know, there's skeptics out there. Nancy Benoit thought that WE's health program was a total joke, and despite the testing, wrestlers still found ways to take steroids. It is a real head-scratcher, though, because Benoit passed all his drug tests leading up to the murders despite having about 10 times the normal amount of testosterone compared to an average guy. I mean, how did that happen? It indeed is a complicated puzzle waiting to be solved. Death of Eddie Guerrero. So, in that Dark Side of the Ring documentary, they shed some light on how everything started going downhill for Benoit. You see, Eddie Guerrero was like his best friend and road partner. They were really close. But then, out of nowhere, Eddie tragically passed away in his hotel room at just 38 years old. Can you imagine how devastating that must have been for Benoit? They were supposed to meet that morning, both him and his nephew Chavo. And Chavo had to be the one to break the news to Benoit. He said Benoit had this emotionless face, and then suddenly he let out this heart-wrenching wail. Man, it was like a soul-crushing heartbreak, you know? Chavo explained that it affected all of them. But Chris, he was hit so much harder. It was like losing a spouse or something, he said. It's crazy how deeply it affected him. And Vicky Guerrero, Eddie's wife, mentioned that Chris would sob uncontrollably in private, like he couldn't control those emotions anymore. It's tough to... Brain trauma. You won't believe what they found when they studied Benoit's brain after those terrible tragedies. Christopher Nowinski, the WWE superstar who's also a Harvard grad, took on this crazy investigation. And guess what? They discovered that Benoit's brain looked like that of an 85-year-old with Alzheimer's disease. Can you imagine? His brain tissue showed severe CTE, that's chronic traumatic encephalopathy, all over the place. Not just in one spot, but all 4 lobes and even the brain stem. It's horrifying to think about what he must have gone through during his wrestling career to end up like that. And get this, all those concussions and those unprotected chair shots he took in the ring might have caused it. Crazy, right? It's mind-boggling to think that the stuff they did back then would get outlawed shortly after. Now, nowadays, concussions are taken super seriously in wrestling and sports in general. But back then, when this all happened, WWE didn't want to admit that his in-ring work and the brain damage could have affected his actions. They called it pure speculation. But you know what? The damage to Benoit's brain was so bad that he was heading towards early dementia. Can you imagine what was going on in his mind? It's just heartbreaking to think about. You know, even to this day, there are so many mysteries and unanswered questions surrounding Chris Benoit's death. People keep coming up with their wild conspiracy theories, suggesting he might have been set up by someone with wicked intentions. But one thing's for sure, as time went on, it's like something dark was brewing inside him, and he was becoming more and more unstable. It's just heart-wrenching to think about how someone who was on his way to becoming one of the all-time great wrestlers could have been suffering so much behind closed doors. It's like this spine-chilling scenario that we can't shake off. But here's the thing, we can use this tragic case as a lesson, you know? It can be a case study to help prevent future tragedies like this from happening. Wrestlers like Kurt Angle and Daniel Bryan have spoken up about how amazing Chris Benoit was in the ring. He left a mark, and he'll never be forgotten.
If you listen to this show, that's no surprise whatsoever. That's just what Kurt did back then. And but it's got to be tough for you, though. You know, you're wrestling Chris Benoit and just not being able to go full bore against someone like him.
You got to be ready when you wrestle Chris Benoit. I mean, he's the most well-conditioned, most intense wrestler I've ever been in the ring with. You have to be on your A game. But Chris is great because he can work around anything. So I knew with my knee injury, we could actually still have a great match.
And that's cool because as intense he was, he still understood, hey, Kurt's got a hurt leg here, and he took care of you in that way, I guess you could say.
And Chris was never stiff or dangerous. The only stiff thing he did was the chops to your chest. Other than that, he was really good. He had a great perception and never stiffed you.
But yeah, we can't ignore those 3 horrifying nights. Those actions he took will always cast a dark shadow over his wrestling achievements. It's a complicated and tragic chapter in wrestling history that we'll never forget.